Get ready to learn a simple and effective way to add layers of depth and detail to your street photography. Let's get into it. It's a summer, and the good news is it's going to be autumn soon. I'll have you know that the shots in this video were captured under great duress and hellfire. By jumping into the obstruction technique, we're going to explore what the obstruction technique is, how to find and use interesting objects for obstruction, and the best settings to achieve those stunning results. Let's jump straight in. So what exactly is the obstruction technique? Well, it's all about shooting through or around objects like windows, fences, foliage to partially obscure your subject. This not only adds layers and depth to your images, but also creates a sense of intrigue. Your viewers will be curious to see what's beyond the obstruction, making your photos more engaging. Now, you might be thinking that this technique is difficult, but it's actually one of the easiest to start with. Begin by finding interesting shop windows, railings, organic material like foliage or trees, basically anything that you can use as the foreground that will partially obscure the subject and the scene that you're shooting. You can photograph lampposts that might have some interesting graffiti or stickers on them, bikes on bike stands, car bonnets, market stalls and signposts. These are all great for this technique because they add an abundant variance of layering with textures and colours, details and even reflections that can also work as a subtle leading line that points in the direction of the subject. Man-made obstructions and foliage such as leaves and trees and any other natural elements can also be used to create a voyeuristic impression. The beauty of this technique is that the sky is the limit in what you can creatively use to partially obscure your subjects. In this image, I framed up so that the car bonnet was prominent. You not only get this interesting reflection from the shop in the bonnet of the car, but you also get the shadow of the bunting that's hanging above, which I think adds more detail and interest to the image. And in this image, we've got a kind of voyeuristic approach where you can see the subject checking her phone in the cafe window, which is also behind a secondary layer of colourful clothing from a vintage clothing shop. None of these images are difficult to shoot. It really is a very simple technique to achieve, and that's what we're getting into next. Just a quick one. If you can please gently smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't already done so. It would make me a very happy person. Your support is always appreciated. When framing with your camera, use up to approximately half of the 9-portion grid of the rule of thirds towards the bottom or the left or right edges of the frame for the obstruction. To me, this is a nice balance of obstruction to subject and scene. If you've got an obstruction on both sides, it doesn't have to be even. The main thing is that the obstruction has some kind of interesting detail or texture. When shooting obstruction elements like bikes and signs, etc., try to get the obstruction close to the frame so that it is emphasized in the foreground. I like to experiment with different amounts of obstruction in the foreground, and you might find that a greater or lesser amount of obstruction works for your compositions. You see, this is what I love about street photography. The entire street is your canvas, and you can make your own rules and find your own style just by using your creativity. So I suggest that you experiment to see what works for you. Then all you have to do is wait for an interesting subject to come along into the frame, or if they are already there, then the work is already done for you. In this photograph, which was one of the last shots of the day, I've literally used somebody's left side of their body as the obstruction. which gently frames the subject in the distance. The viewer looks past the arm, drawing their attention to the woman standing by the shot, engrossed in her phone. This technique uses the foreground obstruction to create depth and direct the viewer's gaze, enhancing the composition by adding an additional layer and a touch of intrigue to the scene. I used this example just to show you that you can creatively use almost anything as an obstruction. When you incorporate objects into the foreground, you're not just adding a random element into the frame. You are creating a multi-dimensional space within your photograph. Think about it this way. In a typical street portrait, you have your subject and maybe a background. It's straightforward, but sometimes it can feel a bit flat. By introducing an obstruction, you're adding an additional layer that draws the viewer's eye deeper into the image. The layering effect is what gives your photos depth. The foreground obstruction acts as an entry point, guiding the viewer's gaze towards the main subject. It's like creating a visual journey for the viewer, leading them through different planes of interest within a single frame. But it's not just about depth, it's about intrigue too. When part of the scene that the subject inhabits is obscured by an object, it can add a sense of mystery. The viewer's eye travels past the obstruction and will naturally become curious to see what's potentially hidden in the distance, keeping them engaged with your photo for longer. They might start to imagine the context, the story behind the scene, and the curiosity that makes your photo that much more compelling. Using certain obstructions such as windows and other elements such as lampposts on either side, you can incorporate the composition technique of frames into your images as well, so that you're getting two different composition techniques for the price of one. So using the obstruction technique effectively can transform a simple shot into a layered, intriguing composition with interesting colours, details, textures, and attention-grabbing perspectives that captivates the viewer's attention and tells a richer story. It's these layers that makes your photo stand out and resonate on a deeper level. In this simple shot, I used the deck chairs not only as an obstruction, but also as a leading line that points towards the subject that you can see framed in between those shower stands. The viewer's eye can journey along those deck chairs that guides the viewer's attention towards the subject. It's all about playing with elements, trying out different angles, and potentially moving your body into different positions to get the shot that you're after. I used both my Ricoh GR3 and GR3X for this technique. What I found by shooting the obstruction technique at multiple focal lengths is that 28mm is great if you want to get as much of the scene as possible whilst including the aforementioned obstructions, or you can use 28mm if you're shooting in very tight conditions such as very narrow streets. You might want to shoot with a slightly narrower focal length of 35mm to 50mm if you want to get closer to your subjects, or if you just want to get a tighter composition. To grab those intrigue style shots where I pick out a subject in the distance by shooting through an obstruction, I mostly use the 71mm crop on the Ricoh GR3X. Shooting at 71mm, whilst it includes the obstructions, it also slightly magnifies the subject in the distance. So experiment with different focal lengths to see what works in different scenarios. Or it's your photography, just simply use your favourite lens and stick to that. Hopefully you guys are in better physical shape than me. Without having a camera on a monopod or a tripod, because of my disability, I cannot select the focus point on the back of the LCD screen to creatively blur the foreground whilst still getting the subject in sharp detail. However, you can do this if you use apertures of approximately f2.8 to f5.6 by having the obstruction near to the frame in the foreground, whilst you use the focus point to latch onto the subject who is behind the obstruction. These are just shameless Photoshop mock-ups showing you what the blurred foreground would look like. I've noticed that on a rare occasion you can blur the obstruction if it's really close to the frame, even at very narrow apertures of like f14. However, I don't want to rely on doing that as the autofocus is erratic at the best of times. To make the obstruction technique work for me, I mainly used narrow apertures from approximately f11 to f14 to achieve the kind of depth that I was looking for so that I could get the obstruction, the subject and the background in sharp detail. In previous videos, I've extolled the benefits of shooting with an auto ISO range of 100 to 3200 with a minimum shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. However, if you want to use my method and shoot at narrow apertures, I believe a slight change of settings is in order. When shooting at narrow apertures of approximately f11 to f14, you're letting in less light into the lens's diaphragm, which can cause your camera to bump up the ISO, even on bright sunny days, resulting in increased noise. While this is manageable for a few shots, you don't want the majority of your photos to be noisy if you are shooting all day long at high ISOs. To address this, I recommend shooting at an auto ISO range of 100 to 800 when shooting at narrow apertures. However, you might need to slightly adjust your auto ISO range based on the lighting conditions that you find yourself in. For me, it was very bright on the day, so a maximum ISO of 800 was sufficient for most of the shooting scenarios that I found myself in. Using an ISO range of 100 to 800 will reduce noise, but it probably will cause your shutter speed at some point to drop below the minimum. But fear not, my good friends, because just know that the minimum shutter speed at which you can capture subjects sharply is probably lower than you think. When I was shooting and the shutter speed dropped below the minimum of 1/250th of a second, I was capturing people at 1/30th of a second without any issues. So if I can do it, I doubt that you'll have any problem capturing subjects at slowish shutter speeds. So here are my updated recommendations. For shooting at narrow apertures, use an auto ISO range of 100 to 800 to reduce noise, but make adjustments based on the lighting conditions. A minimum shutter speed of 1/250th of a second works well for capturing subjects, giving you sufficient light, and faster shutter speeds until the shutter speed drops to the minimum and starts increasing the ISO. For varied lighting, shooting in partially covered or covered areas, and shooting with wide, mid and narrow apertures, stick to an auto ISO range of 100 to 3200 with a minimum shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. This gives you flexibility in different lighting conditions. I shoot all of my stuff in aperture priority, and these are just my recommendations. So if you want to shoot in a different camera mode, choose a different auto ISO range or a faster minimum shutter speed, then go right ahead. It's your photography. Personally, I don't mind a bit of grain as it adds atmosphere, but I would prefer to avoid high ISOs for every shot. Therefore, if I'm going to do the obstruction technique and shoot at very narrow apertures, I'm going to use an auto ISO range from 100 to 800. So, do you have any ideas for obstructions that you can use for this technique? And do you have any other tips or techniques or settings that you would like to share? Please let us know down below. Obstruction is a simple yet powerful technique that adds depth, layers, and intrigue to your street photography. Use a narrow aperture to achieve greater depth or creatively blur foreground obstructions while keeping your subject sharp. and most importantly, practice and experiment to see what works for you. However, if you want to learn how shooting projects can help you become a more successful photographer, then check out this video here. Until we meet again, go forth and create.